Hi, my name is Karen, and today we're going to talk about seines and seining a pond. Seines are a certain type of net, and nets have different designations based on how they're designed, how the ropes are set, and how they're used. For the most part in aquaculture, a seine is what is used to harvest fish from a pond. The parts of a seine are pretty simple. You have the float line with floats hung at regular distances between them. The float line is usually a pretty heavy rope, and then the seine material is attached to the float line with the secondary smaller piece of twine. The size of this twine should be the same or smaller than the twine used in the mesh of the seine. And this is so that if there's a huge force on the seine, this twine will break before breaking the mesh, because this is a lot easier to replace and repair compared to replacing the mesh of the seine. The mesh itself isn't attached to the line. It's the secondary twine that gets attached to the float line. And this allows the stress to be distributed through all the meshes evenly. This is the mesh material. Most of the big commercial ponds, the mesh is made out of polypropylene or polyethylene. It's a buoyant mesh. In tilapia aquaculture, a lot of times they're using a knotless mesh and a softer mesh, which is made of nylon. This one here is knotted. You can also get knotless mesh. At the bottom, we have two types of lines. We have your regular lead line, which is, again, this thick rope with lead weights attached at regular distances, and you have that same secondary twine that is attaching the mesh to the lead line. And this makes the seine pretty heavy and a lot harder to load, say, on a wheelbarrow or something, but it's really advantageous to pulling the seine through a muddy pond. The mud line, it used to be made of about 14 pieces of rope that absorbed water, but lately we've started making them out of old pieces of netting. It has to be nylon netting or a type of netting that sinks. So for people who are located in areas where they're doing a lot of cage culture, a lot of the cage farmers are using nylon netting, and they replace their cages every so often. So you should be able to get old netting with holes in it, and you can twist it up into a line like this and attach it to your lead line. The mud line allows the seine to stay on the bottom of the pond, but just at the surface of the mud. If you didn't have the mud line, these leads would sink down into the mud, and you would end up pulling tons of mud while you're trying to catch the fish. So the mud lines are very, very helpful in muddy ponds, hence the name. The other nice thing I like about these mud lines is that they help the seine go into little dips in the pond bottom. And especially where tilapia are sitting in a nest or something, a lot of times they'll be in a big nest and they'll sit there, and when the seine comes, they'll turn on their side and the seine will miss them. But the mud line will allow you some sinking of the seine into these little dips of tilapia nests or catfish nests or other dips in the ponds. If we're seining by hand and not by tractor, we'll usually attach it to a heavy piece of wood. The wood we buy here is the same wood that's used in the railings for stairs, because it's a clear lumber without knots in it, and it's very sturdy. This wood is expensive, so we don't have a piece of wood for each seine. So we make it with a quick release so we can change out our seines and use the same piece of wood. We call this the braille. This allows us to pull the seine in the right manner. Now, if you don't have a braille, some people try to tie the lead line along their foot, and that makes it really hard on your legs. So the braille helps us pull the seine. If you notice, the seine is deeper than the braille, but that doesn't matter. Okay? Essentially what we're trying to do is trap the fish inside the seine. So the seine has to be pulled through a pond with a curve. Therefore, the seine, if your pond is 20 meters wide, your seine should be about 30 meters long. And that allows the seine to make a curve and is much more efficient at catching fish. If your seine is only as long as the pond is wide, the two seiners on either side end up trying to pull against each other, and it lifts the lead line off the bottom. Now the fish, even if the water is muddy, the fish know where the seine is because they can feel the water movements by their lateral line. And they're actually quite clever. So if you're pulling the seine and it's up off the bottom, they'll all be rushing through the bottom. The other thing you want to do is make sure that the seine height is about 1/3 more than the water depth. If we seine a pond with the water deeper than this, what's going to happen? The lead line is going to pull off the bottom and the fish can go under. So you want a curvature in the seine, and you also want a curvature this way. So in fact, this seine is made for about 1 meter water depth. The easiest way to pull the seine is to take the float line and just pull like this. And that won't catch you very many fish because your lead line is trailing and the fish can easily go under. The most effective way to seine is to lead with the lead line. So if you're pulling this way with the lead line forward and the float line back, that's the most efficient way. You should also have the leader from the lead line a little shorter than the leader from the float line, and that helps keep the float line behind. If you're seining well, the fish, they sense the seine, and some fish will jump, but we are hoping they sense the seine by the time they get back in this curvature, and by the time they jump, they're in the seine already. This seine has what we call a bag on it. It's different than what you know as the cod end of a trawl. The bag is kind of square, okay? And as you're pulling the seine, the bag should be well behind. Usually the bag has a different color float or a different size float on it so you can see where the bag is, and you want to keep the bag in the center. And you want the fish to be following the curvature of the seine, and they end up in here, and you know you've got them when you see them trying to jump out and they can't get out. When we land the seine, we want to have the bag in the center and make sure all our fish go in the bag. So we can actually get our fish trapped in the bag. And then we can set the bag on what we call dead men, if you don't have enough people, and you can work your fish in the bag. So the bag ends up being like a hopper in your pond. We call these dead men. You can make these out of a branch of a tree, but these are made out of cold rolled steel, and they have 2 hooks on them, and then they have another peg that you can use for pushing the dead men in the mud. Normally we are making our dead men now with this foot peg going the opposite way so it doesn't get caught on the mesh of the seine. They're called dead men because they're stiff and they don't move. And you can replace some of your workers with dead men. So instead of paying someone to stand all day in the pond just holding the seine, you can use a dead man. It also prevents your workers from getting too cold in the water. These seines are only as good as the operators. So if you put the seine in the pond wrongly, you will end up not catching any fish. I find it's better to seine once or twice very well as opposed to 10 times poorly. Your seines at a certain point in time might have a mesh that gets cut or several mesh that get cut. And on some of these big stations in the US, the biggest culprit is leaving the seine in the grass and the mowers coming by. Then you get a lot of cuts in your seine. People tend to make an emergency repair by taking the hole, grabbing it, and tying it off. But as you can see, if this is floating in the water, that raises the lead line and it gives a place for the fish to escape. The best way to repair a seine is to actually replace the mesh. It's hard to do on these polyethylene seines because the plastic is hard to knot. Most of these are double knotted and heat set in the knots. So we replace our mesh with nylon rope where the knots don't slip as badly. On knotless seines, it's harder, and you would have to actually cut out the hole and insert a patch on it, especially if the mesh is small. For loading a seine onto a vehicle, you just want to load it in systematic order and zigzag it on top of itself so it will offload almost by itself. You have to be really careful about sharp places on the bed of the vehicle that you're loading on. You don't want to get it caught on anything. And of course the bag is the one big thing. You want to prevent it from getting twisted up in the seine. You can use a wheelbarrow the same way, push cart, pickup truck, anything. When you go into a pond, you put the mud line in first. What we're trying to prevent is the float line getting rolled on the mud line. If that happens, you're probably not going to catch any fish and you'll have to seine again. Because the seine is a shallow seine and the pond is relatively deep, we're going to seine from the deep end to the shallow end. You want to make sure you have at least 50 to 80 centimeters of water when you're landing the seine, so the fish still have some water to spread out in. That black thing standing in the pond is a standpipe, and that's where the drain is. So you have to seine around that and make sure the fish don't get behind the seine. So they're going to show you how to go around the standpipe and preventing any fish from being behind the seine. We want them all to be forward from the seine. You actually make the shape of a W with the seine. So you bring up a lot of slack, pull up sufficient seine to go up and then back around the standpipe. Typically, because you're being active in the pond, most of the fish have been scared down the other way. But especially if you're landing the seine at the deep end, you have to be really careful, because the time the fish get away is at the very end of the seining, usually, when they are panicking because they're crowded together. If you only need a couple fish, you don't have to be very efficient at seining. But if you want all your fish out of the pond, it's good to do it the right way first. Mark is standing out behind now because he's going to make sure that the bag is properly situated behind the seine and it's open. If the bag were rolled up in the seine, the fish would not be able to be trapped in there. There's no need to rush. It's better to go a bit slowly so you make sure that your mud line stays on the bottom of the pond. You see the nice curve. That's very good. And as we get into shallower water, the seine will also be curved vertically as well as horizontally. Even though there's a lot of mud in this pond, notice it only takes 2 people. When I see videos of people seining a pond and they have 20 people bending down, pulling their lead line, it tells me that number 1, their seine is probably made poorly, and number 2, they don't know how to seine efficiently. This pond here is about 1,000 square meters, and you notice it's a very long rectangle, so we don't need a very long seine to get across the pond. If we had 1,000 square meter pond that was a square, we would need a much bigger seine. If by chance there's a piece of wood or something preventing the lead line from moving forward, you will notice that the floats sink in that area, and you can go to that area and pull up and go over it. These ponds used to have sloped banks, and because of the aeration, the banks have been eroded, and that's where the mud comes from in the pond bottom. Okay, it's a lot easier for someone up on the bank to pull the net in, and the person down in the pond should just keep the mud line down on the bottom. So you can do with, depending on how many fish you're landing, with 1 or 2 people. But you always turn your braille so the float line is to the outside and the mud line is to the inside. And then we do the heavy pulling from the bank. Try to keep the bag in the middle. At the last bit, everyone will take a corner of the bag. The seine kind of makes a tunnel, and if you don't put your arm under it and close that off, the fish can run up that curve. So now they're sure they have all the fish. They have their arm under the seine and they're backing off into deep water. Depending on how many fish you catch and how big your bag is, you can hold it up with 2 dead men holding the float and the mud line together, or with 4, each one taking a corner of the bag. 2 on the float line, 2 on the mud line. And we keep one side low and the other side's high. The person dipping the fish out of the bag will be on the low side. When you're operating a bag with a nylon net, you have to be very careful not to put the net mesh through the peg of the dead man. You should put it on the mud line or the float line. If you want to immobilize a catfish, you do it the same way as for a salmon. You press the caudal peduncle from top to bottom, and that prevents them from moving. So you make a compression top to bottom right here. A good male in spawning condition will have a rather large head. It will have distinct muscle pads right here on top of the head. Usually they're a little darker at this time of year, but it really depends on the watercolor. They are often not all that fat and have some evidence of fighting during spawning season. They'll have a genital papilla that's prominent and sometimes might be swollen and pinkish. So this one's been fighting a little bit. It definitely has these big muscle pads. So very good condition. You don't want them too fat. They tend to not perform well when they have a lot of body fat.